Welcome to The Humble Philosopher. So, I have a thought experiment that I believe could be the foundation for a proof of free will. And it's called the locked in thought experiment. And to understand it, first one must understand that there literally is something called locked in syndrome that can happen to people when they have something like a brain aneurysm or a severe head trauma, in which they are completely paralyzed except they're able to blink their eyes and move their eyes vertically. There was a man who had a brain aneurysm and had locked in syndrome, who, through blinking his eyes, was able to develop a language that allowed him to dictate his own memoir. It was a book called The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, and it became a movie. And so the locked in thought experiment is just taking that level of paralysis one step further and imagining a condition where somebody is fully conscious in their body but has no free will over it at all. So they're not even able to blink their eyelids or move their eyes. And if you compare that level of locked in syndrome next to the level where you're able to blink your eyes, you see very clearly that the necessary precondition for language from a human body, from a consciousness inside a human body, is some level of free will. You take all free will away and there's no ability to language. You give only the barest minimum of free will, which is just the ability to blink one's eyes, which has no inherent meaning of its own. And all language and meaning, all communication can flow from that. The way this is meaningful to the argument over free will and determinism is to understand that those who are arguing for determinism, and now it's very important to understand that there is only absolute determinism. A lot of what passes for determinism is really just conditioned free will. It's just saying that there's all these other things that condition free will that can be so much stronger than free will that we're not really free, but that line of argument always hides that it's holding on to some iota of free will. Absolute determinism is the only real determinism. And this is what Robert Sapolsky is clearly arguing for. He says he's part of a lunatic fringe that believes that there is no free will at all. And he says, why? Because anything else would be magic. And Sam Harris has made the same arguments where, he says very clearly everything is actually just a long domino chain. And you're no more able to make choices in the present moment than you would be able to, if you were to watch a live conversation or you were to watch a recorded tape of that conversation, they're the same. They're going to play out as they're going to play out. That's absolute determinism. And to certain scientists, or to certain people of a scientific mind, that appeals because it flows directly from known physical laws. The problem with free will and any iota of free will is that it violates known physical law. That's the whole rub. And so obviously I'm arguing for free will, and so I'm juxtaposing these two things. So you can imagine a level of complete paralysis in which somebody is still fully alive in their body, but they have no control over it. They're unable to communicate. You give them one iota of free will, voluntary muscle movement, the ability to blink their eyes, which has no inherent meaning, and all of a sudden all language and all meaning can flow. The absolutists, the absolute determinists, people like Sam Harris and Robert Sapolsky, are arguing for no free will whatsoever. It's an illusion. It never existed. I appreciate that because that's at least congruent, right? That's not trying to back end free will, which both of them end up doing because they make appeal to choice later. trying to hold on to meaning, that sort of stuff, all of which would disappear if we had actually no free will. But even the absolute terminists admit that consciousness exists. They admit that they're conscious. They admit that other people are conscious. We're all composed of atoms and molecules, which are themselves the universe. That means that in a determinist universe, consciousness exists, but free will doesn't. But what does that make of the universe? That would mean that the entire universe has locked-in syndrome. Complete locked-in syndrome. Absolute locked-in syndrome. No free will. And so it would be like that version of locked-in syndrome where one couldn't communicate at all. And yet, obviously, there's language all around us. It's the only way you're understanding what I'm talking about. And so I was discussing this with my father today and just kicking it around. And when I first formulated this, I was saying that language is the necessary precondition. I'm sorry. I was saying that free will is the necessary precondition of language. And I was wondering if that was imprecise speech. Maybe free will is just the precondition of language. And I don't need to say necessary, except there are other preconditions of language, space, time, existence, matter, energy, all preconditions. But they're not the necessary precondition of free will. And so this whole discussion over whether free will exists or not can just be sort of a fun thought experiment that can help sort of, pierce deeper into reality because it forces you to use your imagination in certain constrained ways and certain principled ways. And so forgive me, I know I'm sort of, this may sound like a word salad or word soup to people, but I promise you it's really not. Because this is, by trying to imagine the role of language in a completely predetermined universe, it's a stark relief of what language actually is. And arguing that free will is the necessary precondition, right? There are other preconditions, but the necessary precondition of language is free will. And, juxtaposing the two, I think there's a way to then get a glimpse at what language really is. And, keep in mind that your DNA is language. There's this problem of where does information come from? Things in formation. They are in, pull those, that word into two words, in and form, in and formation. A disorganized army can fall into formation. They can form themselves. That's the whole point of, getting, marching and muster is to learn how to move as one unit. So just thinking this through, just hoping that, somebody out there, my hope beyond hope is that somebody who is good with math and formalization could take this thought experiment and formalize it. And I really think, humble philosopher or not, this could prove the existence of free will in the right hands. So I was trying to is it that free will is the precondition of language or the necessary precondition of language? And it's the necessary precondition of language. Because languaging is not just movement. Languaging, using language is not just movement. It's not just movement of one's lips. It's not just the gross motion through matter. It's the meaning that is placed on that motion that is separate from the motion. Here's what I mean by that. Determinism could account for the movement of my lips right now, right? People out there like, I don't understand what he's saying. His lips are just moving, right? Determinism could account for the motion. Determinism could not account for the meaning in the motion. That's the juxtaposition. That's the stark relief. That's why free will, there are other conditions, there are other preconditions for language, but the necessary precondition for language is free will. Without free will, there is no meaning. And without meaning, there is no language. There is the movement of my mouth, the air coming out, the pressure waves, all of that, right? I mean, that's what's fascinating about, just the thought experiment of, okay, pure determinism. So everything's determined, which means it's really just this domino chain. And so imagine that you're facing all these dominoes and that you can start to see the domino behind the domino, behind the domino, behind the domino, behind the domino. And then you try to account for that on these different dimensions. I'll give you an example. It was really sad, but over the weekend, I sat in on a Zoom funeral for somebody that I grew up with as a part of this church community that we were in when I was a kid. And as part of the Zoom presentation at parts, you could see people's names on the screen. And so there was my name next to this woman whose first name is Corin. And we were part of a religious household when we were kids. And another woman's name was Denise, and she was a very close friend of the family who is the mother of what would have been my oldest friend from childhood. And so all of this is taking place in physical space. But here's this dimension of meaning that these words on the screen are opening up to me that wouldn't open up to anyone else that didn't have my history and didn't have my particular neural set. And so absolute determinism could account for the absolute position of all those particles in space at that time, but could never capture the window in meaning that all of that opens up for me, that I open up in it. And so free will can account, absolute determinism can account consistently within its own argumentation for the arrangement of particles in space. It's consistent within the phenomenon of motion. The Big Bang sets everything into motion, and it's just the domino chain. It's the conservation of momentum following all the way through. And so the placement of all those atoms that create my computer and all those atoms that create me and the photons coming out and falling on my eye, all that is consistent with some initial cause that leads to that moment in time. But there's no way for it to account for the dimension of language. And as the thought experiment shows, if there is no voluntary motion, there is no capacity to languaging. If there is only the barest iota of voluntary movement, which is free will, right? I mean, think about how absurd it is that you have no free will, but that your own body is ordered along voluntary muscle motions and involuntary. You take all voluntary motion away, and language cannot express itself in a human body. You give just one window of voluntary motion, and now all language can flow. Even the absolute determinists admit that consciousness exists. But if they take away free will, that consciousness is locked in, how then does language ever arise? And since the language is all around us, and I'm literally sitting on a couch just having an experience through the dimension of language, and the thought experiment shows that free will is the necessary precondition for language. That's why it would be nice to pair up with somebody who could do formalization. Because otherwise, then it just, at the end of it, it's just constant argumentation. But, that's just a thought that's come from, trying to imagine what the implications of complete determinism would be. And make no mistake about it, there is only complete determinism, or there is conditioned free will. Anything less or more than complete determinism is an admission of some level of free will. Any admission of some level of free will, yes, is an admission of some level of magic. I will agree with Robert Sapolsky on that. Free will violates everything that we know about physical law. That's why scientists are against it. However, without free will, there's no way to explain the dimension of language, and that is the dimension that we live in. So anyways, that's my 2 cents on that. Thanks for clicking on this.